Originally, I planned for this video to just have the in-game audio. However, it wasn't until after I recorded that I realized I did not have my audio settings correct. So instead, you get my lovely voice. It's not that the background audio is completely unusable, but rather my mic was recording and it wasn't directly in front of me, so you may hear some occasional thuds and whatnot in the background. But it's pretty hard to notice if I talk over it, so I'm just gonna talk over it instead. But you know what, that's fine. This gives me an opportunity to discuss some of my thoughts on Monster Hunter, specifically Iceborne. And I guess in a way this is a part 2 to my video about changes I would like to see in, say, Monster Hunter Wilds, because having now improved a lot at Iceborne since that video, my opinions have changed, and I was incorrect about a few things, and I need to make some corrections regarding the original video. But first, a few notes about the background footage. So this is my second time hunting Raging Brachydios. The first hunt went almost exactly like it did in the second hunt, where I took it slow, hence the term casual in the title, because I feel no need to try to speedrun this monster and potentially end up spending more time on it, having to farm it more by trying to be too optimal too fast. And as for the set I'm using, it's the Guild Palace Gunlance. I have a layered armor over it, and I'm primarily using Zora Magdaros armor set, and my defense is like 950 on this build. It's really not that high. I know that when I've seen forums talk about fighting Raging Brachydios, they expect you to have closer to 1100 defense, as well as an augmented weapon. I did not do that, but I'm also not trying to slay it in 10 minutes. But if you are going to take on this fight, full blast resistance is an absolute must. Unless you just like pain and suffering, you could be one of those people. But what I find so interesting about first facing Raging Brachydios, I was coming into this fight expecting it to be incredibly difficult. So I prepared the best I could. Granted, I probably could have prepared more by having more augmented armor. I think only one piece of my armor is augmented, and it's a rarity 9, so not a lot of defense there. It's the best way I could fit Divine Blessing on the build. But previously I went up against Furious Rajang, and that was a much harder fight for me. The first time I attempted it in the, I think it's the Monkey Business event quest, and I tried that over a month ago. I got completely stomped into the ground. And my second attempt, I came at it with a build very similar to the one you're seeing on screen. And unfortunately, my game crashed on the second attempt. So I had to take it out the third attempt, but I managed to not cart on the third attempt. So I guess I'm improved there. That's a hard fight, though. I do not like fighting Furious Rajang at all. But Raging Brachydios I found to actually be kind of easy. Now, obviously, it's not the type of free win that you can effectively do in your sleep. You do have to think about it. But I was expecting Furious Rajang level difficulty, and for some reason that's not what I got. That is why the 2 times that I have hunted this, I have yet to cart, which is crazy because I've gotten wrecked by seemingly much easier monsters. But that is one of the more curious aspects about Monster Hunter World / Iceborne, because I have seen across several different places some of people's least favorite monsters, and it is all over the place. Obviously, for a lot of people, the Fatalis is really hard. Some of the arch-tempered Elder Dragons are really hard. But sometimes it's things like Diablos or Velkhana, just the normal Velkhana. And I find that really interesting. And that's one of the coolest aspects of this game that was completely missing in Rise, by the way, is there's so much variety in how each weapon plays, combined with the different play styles that are in the same weapon, combined with the different builds that people find comfortable. It's as if everyone has their own unique check in Monster Hunter, where there's so much variety. One monster, it could be Fatalis, it could just be Diablos, ends up being a skill check, or even just always stays difficult. And I think that shows just how complex and nuanced this game is. The thing is, I didn't see nearly as much discussion about the different hard matches for people in Monster Hunter Rise. And I think it's because that game specifically makes up for the inherent weaknesses of each weapon very well. I also think it's a bit more limiting in your playstyles too. Even though it may seem like with the switch skills and wire bugs that there's more variety to playstyles, I've actually found it to be less, which is one of the reasons why I prefer World so much more to Rise. Because Rise gets to where you have to use the wire bug skills almost exclusively in Sunbreak, and that takes away from half of the weapon's mechanics, basically. What I'm getting at is the wire bug gimmick was way too strong, and I think it got in the way of how each weapon felt and some of their uniqueness. Even if on the surface they look so much more unique, it feels less unique because the weaknesses of each weapon don't come out as well. When even the gun lance can fly around, it's no longer slow and clunky, which takes away the whole feel of the gun lance. It's supposed to be slow and clunky. But seeing such a variety in how people consider the difficulty of Iceborne is just really interesting to me. But what I also wanted to get into real quick is that to some extent, I don't think I had quite the right assessment about how I would want Monster Hunter to change in the future. Now, I still am of the opinion that an open world concept would not actually break Monster Hunter. The Guiding Lands is a good example of this because they could just make the entire game sort of feel like the Guiding Lands, and I think that would work out. It's obviously a controversial take. Some people don't like the Guiding Lands, but I actually do. You can still have quests even with the Guiding Lands style of exploration focus. And with the Monster Hunter team liking to mix things up consistently, that would definitely be a big mix-up. But I want to address my thoughts on game difficulty because playing through the story, man, I thought Iceborne was so difficult. And now, as you can see in the background, one of the potentially hardest fights in the game, it doesn't seem that bad now. But I still have some thoughts about the difficulty going through the story, because while I don't think the fight should be easier, I do think that being able to prepare for fights needs to be easier while you're still progressing through the story. Because the way Iceborne has it set up, you're getting like 10 times the amount of decorations post-game. And you get access to armor that has so much more decoration slots that you can fit on, and they have much better skills. It makes those story fights almost seem trivial once you have a post-game build. But some of the story fights are hard even when you have a fairly thought out build. I know that was me with Valkana. That fight's just a pain. But I think the game could be more approachable if, while you're progressing through the story, it's easier to build out better armor sets and have those armor sets be a bit more flexible and the kind of decorations you can fit on them. I also wouldn't mind some of those lower rarity armor sets being more viable in general, so that you don't have to just throw them away and only use the 3 late game armor sets that the game gives you. Being able to balance the game in such a way that those earlier armor sets can still stay viable post-game, I think would actually make a lot of sense. Because, man, some of them are just absolutely useless. Even going through the story, some of them are still useless. So I wouldn't mind if the armor balance was a bit more spread out, and that getting decorations through the story is easier. At least getting the decorations that you need for the specific fights. Though the way Iceborne was set up, they expected you to be in post-game for a while in the base game, which in that sense it kind of makes sense and you'd have a stack of decorations to work with. But if you don't spend any time in post-game going from base world to Iceborne, you have like no kit to work with effectively. And I think they could do better with that specific aspect so that you don't have to be hunter rank 50 to start getting a decent amount of decorations that you can work with for the DLC. So I don't think like the difficulty of fights should really be changed in the story. Iceborne has a lot of difficulty, but it's also very rewarding once you take out the stuff and progress through. But I think building out optimal kit for those fights needs to be easier to do. for those that need it, because not everyone can speedrun a Furious Rajang in 4 minutes. I know certainly I can't. That takes me about 25 minutes to take out Furious Rajang. So those story fights can be quite difficult, and if you don't have the right decorations to build with, and you're not that skilled, it's like almost impossible. So I think that could be more convenient. Even if technically the difficulty's the same, the ability to prep would be better. That's at least how I think it should be. Though I wouldn't mind if the absolute painfully difficult fights are definitely available in post-game. I think that makes a lot of sense, because some people need that challenge. But while thinking about this video, I did have some other ideas for things I would like to see in Wilds as well. I would like it if the monsters had a bit of a larger move set to work with, so that there's a bit more variety in how they fight you, and possibly make them a bit less predictable somehow, essentially improving the AI. I imagine Wilds will have improved AI, but I think that's something that could be quite useful and also not controversial. Now, another idea I had for Monster Hunter Wilds that I think could be quite an interesting thing is something similar to what is in Monster Hunter Stories 2, where you can go on these multiplayer explorations into effectively randomly generated caves. And in Stories, you primarily do it to farm eggs. But I think in a normal Monster Hunter game, it could be very interesting if you had sort of these randomly generated combat scenarios where you have to fight through 3 mystery monsters, and maybe you can bring like 2 weapon sets with you. And the amount of rewards you get for that quest would be dependent on how many of the monsters you manage to take out. I think that could be a really fun post-game thing that would definitely mix it up. And you could have the rewards be some kind of special ticket that can give you some really cool stuff. But as far as I know, that's not something that has been done in any Monster Hunter game previously. And also a bit more out there, I think it would be cool if Wilds had a carving knife tree, so that you could get different carving knives that either give you more carves or they give you better odds of getting specific parts off of carves. It's something that could make having to farm specific parts on a monster a little bit easier to do, and give you even more ways to prepare for your fight. I still think Wirebug shouldn't be in the game though. That was just a mistake. And I still don't like the SOS flare system. I feel like there's a less clunky way they could do multiplayer. I'm also not the biggest fan of the clutch claw, having to weaken monster parts and such. I wouldn't mind monster fights that are a bit more straightforward in Wilds. Which is probably why I play Gunlands, because you don't have to weaken parts, just fire off the boomstick. But I think overall the Monster Hunter series is actually really great. Obviously there's a few odds and ends I would like to just have a little bit of work done on them. But I think the general principle of Monster Hunter and how it flows is pretty great as is. I am now aware that Monster Hunter cycles between a mainline game that is designed for effectively consoles and I guess now PC with Wilds, and that each of those main games correspond with a number. That's why in Monster Hunter World your character is referred to as a 5er. That's Monster Hunter 5. Wilds is Monster Hunter 6, so I imagine there's going to be some clever ways they keep that number system. But I didn't realize why Rise felt so different until realizing that it's supposed to be so different, because it's made from the development team that focuses primarily on their mobile games. And those games are generally more streamlined and have a far more creative way of changing the combat, which is why it has wire bugs and switch skills and later like the switch scrolls or whatever they're called. And now it makes so much more sense that Rise is a drastically different game. Which, for those of you who don't like that more arcadey style, Wilds is not going to be like that, because it's a mainline numbered game. It's Monster Hunter 6. If anything, it's going to be a lot more like World, but I also don't think it is going to be World 2. And I think that would actually be a mistake for Capcom to do that, because they don't need a World 2. They already have World, and people are continuing to purchase World and play through World. It's more popular now than it ever has been. So Capcom doesn't need a World 2. They need a new game that is able to bring in new people that World cannot bring in. So for everyone that is expecting, or I guess wanting a World 2, is probably going to be very disappointed with Wilds. Personally, I want Wilds to feel like a considerably different game than World, because I don't want to just play through World again. If I wanted to do that, I could go create a new profile in World and go through it that way. And I think that's the mindset people who like the older games fall into, is they want a continuation of all the mechanics of the older games, just with maybe updated graphics, new monsters to fight, so on and so forth. But it is better for the Monster Hunter team to focus on new experiences with each game. And with that will come drastic differences. And obviously over time, Monster Hunter has become increasingly less clunky, and some people are, upset about that. And I can understand that. But I think it's part of Monster Hunter becoming more popular and them trying to reach a broader audience with it. And even just looking at the original Wilds trailer, it is so obvious that it is a massive departure from World. Because you have a mount. That is a thing in Rise. There's the Palamute. But in this case, you get whatever this gliding chicken thing is, with what is clearly an extra weapon on it in a bag. And even the whole setup for the ending of the trailer, where the hunter is overlooking a large area, that screams Breath of the Wild style game. Like, it's so incredibly similar. And because of that, I'm expecting a massive departure, and so much of it indicates open world, even if it may not actually be an open world. The environments are probably going to be huge. Like, it's possible each level is going to be equivalent to maybe like 2 or 3 of the different areas in World combined. So the scale is obviously going to be higher. And even in just the normal wildlife, all the little creatures you see running around, there's like 100 of them, which you may see 100 total in the ancient forest in World. So it's obvious that things are scaled up dramatically. And even the naming, it's called Wilds. I feel like there's so many things about it that indicate the game is going to be more open and, I guess, feel more, well, like Breath of the Wild, honestly. There's so many aspects of that trailer that just look like Breath of the Wild reskinned as Monster Hunter. And that's kind of what I'm expecting. And I'm well aware that a lot of people don't like that. I'm fine with it, because it's something new for Monster Hunter to do. And I'm pretty confident that it's not going to be a Monster Hunter Rise clone, because it's the mainline team that's making this game, not the mobile team. So while I do understand wanting a game series to feel very similar across the different titles, I think Capcom has a greater incentive to mix it up, and potentially in a very drastic way this time. And I think that an open world style game is the best way to aim for the stars and try to pull in as much people into the Monster Hunter series as possible. And for those who want World, World is still around for now. And there's the older Monster Hunter games for those who prefer the older style. But Wilds will be something completely different. Even if some of the combat will likely be the same, there's probably going to be a new combat gimmick that's not the clutch claw. Maybe you can fight on top of your combat chicken or whatever it is. Maybe there could be like combos you can do with your ride. That would be kind of interesting. But don't get your hopes up on a reskinned World, because it's quite clear this is not a reskinned World. This is a completely different game. It's not a reskinned Rise either, because it's not the same team from Rise. Anyway, moving on. There is also one more thing that I would like to see adjusted in the new game. Can we get rid of slot machines, man? Why does Iceborne straight up have a slot machine in it? Like, they're not even hiding that they want things to be RNG. Ugh. I feel like that's a bit much. And so many things are like a 0.9% chance to obtain. I know it's supposed to prolong the amount of time that you spend playing the game, but I feel like there's better ways to do it than that. But aside from like those small critiques, I think the Monster Hunter series is very good. Obviously, the amount of convenience that a player would want in Monster Hunter is very dependent on what the first Monster Hunter game you played was. I know many of the veterans of the series would prefer the game to be less convenient than World, because that adds to the overall experience. Whereas players that like Rise don't like how clunky and inconvenient World feels. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I like the clunky combat of Monster Hunter. I don't think that should change. And I don't even mind a more ecological focus on your hunts, where it's less about just going and killing the monster and more about kind of an exploration sort of feel. But some monsters have such high hit pulls that you have to start fighting them instantly, otherwise you're going to time out. Maybe that's something they could work on. Just generally lower HP pulls, but just make them more dangerous. I think that could be fun, so that while, yes, you do take them out faster, they also take you out faster. I think that would be pretty cool. And it would give you more time to just experience the environment, and you wouldn't have to be thinking so much, oh, I've got to get back to the fight, because the dude's probably still at 80% health and I'm 10 minutes in. I do think that could be fun. But don't make them more difficult by speeding them up, please. There's already fast enough monsters in Iceborne, like Rajang and Furious Rajang. Those things are so fast. I know that with proper positioning, they're very easy fights if you have S-tier positioning. Not everyone does, though. And even though the fight's doable for me, I still hate it, because of how sped up Rajang and Furious Rajang feel compared to pretty much any other monster. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts that I had about the game, and some of the things that could be different or better or whatever. And I hope you enjoyed this casual hunt in the background, and I'm sure some of you are keeping tabs on every single error that I make. Man, I still have 2 more minutes to fill in. I guess I'll just talk more about the Brachydios fight. So, the reason I think that Raging Brachydios was a lot easier than I expected is because the way I play Gunlance works really well against the slower, clunkier monsters, and Raging Brachydios happens to be more so the slow, clunky style, which is probably also why Furious Rajang gave me such a hard time, because I don't play well against the faster stuff. Although I did okay against, Vion Garuga. That thing's pretty fast, but it's a fairly manageable fight as long as you maintain your pacing and understand when your openings are. Because if you try to capitalize too quickly sometimes, and you're not just like the S-tier skill level player, you can get comboed into oblivion by some of those faster monsters. So for a normal player, it pays to take it slow and not try to fight the timer too much. Because, from my experience, you're less likely to make mistakes if you don't try to go overboard on optimizing your times. That is, of course, just my experience with Gunlance, the clunkiest weapon in the game. Things may be different for different people. But anyway, I hope this was an interesting video to you, and I thank y'all so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.